Okay, welcome, good evening. Welcome to this GCF-GEF Pavilion event brought to you by the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. We're really pleased to have you here and to also have colleagues joining virtually. So just to my person, my name is Andreas Reumann. I'm the acting head of the Independent Evaluation Unit here at the Green Climate Fund. And I'm really pleased to have so many colleagues from me, from the evaluation space joining me here tonight. Some here on stage as well as others virtually. So it's going to be a very interesting and exciting discussions about lessons learned on how to evaluating climate action. So investments in adaptation and resilience are of keen interest to the climate community in general, but also here at COP26. And the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund has just recently conducted an independent evaluation on the GCF's adaptation portfolio and approach, and which looks at what it takes for the GCF, a very young and large and ambitious climate fund, to contribute to adaptation interventions with scale, depth and duration in developing countries. The role of adaptation is also of interest to other institutions, such as the Independent Evaluation Department of the Asian Development Bank, ICRAF World Agroforestry Center, the Technical Evaluation Reference Group of the Adaptation Fund, and the German Institute for Development Evaluation. And so what we're going tonight, we're going to hear from all of the panelists to get some insights into what are we learning in the space of climate change, adaptation and investments. This event will be structured in 3 parts. So first of all, we will hear from our panelists, really brief presentations on the evaluative work, the considerations that one would have to look at when thinking about climate change adaptation and evaluations in this space, as well as lessons learned from the climate adaptation space. This will be followed by a very interesting, hopefully interesting and insightful panel discussion where we hear on further thoughts from the panelists. And then before that, after that, we will just open up to questions by the audience here to also hear your thoughts, and maybe we can enlighten you with some of our learnings just right away. So let me just briefly introduce the panelists as well as the presenters. So we have one panelist as Mr. Nathan Sarimiyan. He's the director of the Independent Evaluation Sector and Project Division, the IESP at the Independent Evaluation Department of the Asian Development Bank. He's here tonight virtually, and he will be appearing on the screen shortly. In his role, he's been part of the EAD leadership team and overseeing evaluations of sector and project evaluations, validations, in particular in the energy, transportation, water, urban, finance, and agricultural, natural resources, and private sector operations. He's more than 23 years of professional experience and 13 years spent at ADB. We've also got Garrett Kilroy. Garrett is a senior evaluation specialist at the Independent Evaluation Department of the Asian Development Week. He has 20 years experience in working in water, resources and environment, climate change and other evaluations in institutions in Europe and Asia. We've also got with us a panelist, Dr. Larissa Duguma. He works with the Sustainable Landscape and Integrated Climate Action at ICRAF, the World Agroforestry Center. Those are our virtual colleagues. We've also got colleagues here on stage. And so first, let me introduce to you Ms. Debbie Menezes, the chair of the Adaptation Fund's Technical Evaluation Reference Group. Debbie has over 25 years of experience in international development, spanning across the South, Central Asia, China, Africa, and the UK. Her experience extends to climate change adaptation, urban resilience, regional connectivity, transboundary water, human development, governance, and gender and social inclusion. So very rich and insightful experience, and we're really happy to have you. In addition, we've also got Mr. Claudio Volonte, who's sitting here. Thank you for being with us. Claudio has 25 years of experience in development management, monitoring, and evaluations of sustainable development investments, programs, and institutions, both for the public and private sector. Adaptation and climate change is one of his personal and professional passions. And he has worked for most of the major multilateral climate funds, such as the GEF, the Adaptation Fund, the SCCF, the LECF, and the GCF. And we're really pleased to have him. We were planning to have also Mr. Sven Harten, the Deputy Director of the German Institute for Development Evaluations. He's coming in a little bit late, so we're looking forward to see him later. And then we've got also two members here from the IEU. We've got Victoria Khan, a data analyst here at the IEU, and has been with the IEU for more than 2 years, so it's really, really good to have that close eye on things on the ground and things from the evaluation office. And we've also got Dr. Archie Rastogi, the evaluation advisor of the IEU, and really pleased to have him here as well. He's just recently completed as a task lead the private sector evaluation of the GCF here at the Independent Evaluation Unit. So it's really great to have him as well to talk about a couple of things. So let's start with apologies for being so long-winded here with the presentation, but it's such a great panel. So let's start with the first presentation by Victoria on some of the key takeaways of our evaluation, so the Independent Evaluation Unit's evaluation of the GCF's adaptation portfolio as well as approach. So over to you, Victoria.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for this great introduction. Now, maybe I'd like... Oh, so I have the slides on the screen already. Yeah, so my name is Victoria, and I'm, along with two of my other colleagues, I'm the delegate of the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund to COP26. Yeah, and really excited to be here to facilitate this conversation on the lessons learned from the evaluations and how they are informing the decision making. So a little bit about, for our audience in terms of the background, GCF funds projects in adaptation thematic area. So in order to increase resilience and adaptive capacity to climate change and in different result areas. So we have 4 result areas of under adaptation theme. And this particular evaluation that is called Evaluation of Adaptation Approach and Adaptation Portfolio of the GCF was conducted in 2020, and we submitted it to the GCF board at the beginning of this year. Yeah, so for the 28th board meeting in March. Yeah, yeah, and here you can see, sorry, not yet. Yeah, here you can see some key messages and key findings from the evaluation, but of course I'm not going to go one by one, and this is just some of them, not all of them, but rather I'd like to give a summary and the main messages that we derived. Yeah, and to start with the definition, so adaptation is defined very broadly and flexibly in the GCF ecosystem. So it allows actually a wide range of interventions, and mostly those are linked to sustainable development, but in a setting with high climate risks. Yeah, and actually it gives a great advantage of being able to customize the projects to specific country setting. However, it comes with downsides. So there is a loss of precision in policies and strategies related to adaptation. Yep, and yeah, sorry, and well, given that the GCF mandate requires GCF to be more relevant to adaptation, yeah, and have a specific approach to adaptation programming by funding the large-scale projects with high-risk appetite and relevant to climate needs and priorities. Yeah, maybe this is some area for improvement. The other observation that we had is that the there is some reasonable stakeholder engagement with other climate funds, private sector, and MDBs. However, this is not systematized and somewhat limiting in ensuring and enhancing complementarity and coherence, as well as knowledge sharing within the delivery of the adaptation planning and implementation. In terms of the capacity for adaptation planning, absolutely GCF responded to the COP guidance by establishing the Readiness and Preparatory Support Program to support developing countries in adaptation planning. However, as of the report writing, 139 million USD were approved through grants, but it reached only 37% of the eligible countries. So there are several challenges and issues identified, such as capacities, requirement for the proposal developments, and other challenges. The other point that stood out was more on private sector, and I believe my colleague Archie will speak more about it a bit later. But definitely, it's a well-known challenge to leverage private sector funds into adaptation space, because this is normally very difficult to generate revenue streams. And currently all private sector projects are driven by MDBs, so we don't see any national entities, and they face a lot of challenges in accessing the GCF. And starting from mid-2018, actually the private sector portfolio in adaptation hasn't grown a lot in the GCF, so it's some indication of some underlying trend, and most probably hinting on the opportunities with blended finance. In terms of portfolio itself, so we, as of report writing, we had 67 adaptation projects, and only one of them is large scale. All other projects are small size projects. Only 4 of them are programs. And it takes longer for adaptation projects to get approved compared to mitigation. And of course, direct access, so national entities experience much longer timelines, even compared to the average in the portfolio. So this, this is definitely one area that can be addressed. Then, so our overall message that there are systemic challenges that national entities face in accessing, and entities with lower capacities, and that actually the adaptation finance doesn't reach the most vulnerable countries. And based on that, we have several. Is it working? We have several recommendations. In terms of positioning in adaptation finance, we should GCF should clarify its role and vision for climate adaptation, and implement methods to enhance complementarity with other funds. So as I mentioned before, that's what we discovered in our findings. In terms of capacity building and planning, so RPSP challenges, RPSP, the Readiness and Preparatory Support Program, the challenges in accessing those funds should be addressed as well. In terms of scale and private sector, there should be a specific defined approach to engaging with private sector, and possibly through a separate programming window. In terms of access and business model, so of course, GCF should respond to the urgency in adaptation by addressing policy gaps, as well as use a wider range of financial instruments rather than plain vanilla grants. And results and impact. Now we have a couple takeaways and recommendations in this area as well. So related to measurement of results and impacts to enhance active monitoring, and of course allow the fund level aggregation of climate indicators. In terms of innovation in risk, currently there is very little guidance on the definition of innovation within the GCF ecosystem, so some guidelines on how to approach this would be very helpful as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. This has been hopefully very insightful for most of you. I just want to highlight that this report is out. It has been submitted to the board and is also publicly available. We really encourage you to look at that. Without further ado, I'd like to move over to the next speaker from the Asian Development Bank, and I invite Jared to just walk us through the findings from the Asian Development Bank on adaptation and on climate interventions.
Hi, Andreas. Greetings from Manila. Can you hear me and see the presentation okay?
Yes, we can hear you and see the presentations.
Great.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, yeah, my name is Garrett Kilroy. I work for the Independent Evaluation Department of Asian Development Bank. And I'll run through some findings we have on adaptation as part of our higher level evaluation of ADB support for action on climate change. I'll just have a quick slide on context. I'll provide some findings on ADB's strategy for adaptation and the portfolio, some findings on performance and results, and some key takeaways. So just on context, you know, our region is Asia and the Pacific. You know, it's a high emitting region in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also highly vulnerable, and particularly our low-lying states like the Maldives and Marshall Islands. In terms of strategies, we looked at ADB's adaptation strategies from 2011 to 2020, and the strategies and guidance mainly focused on climate proofing of infrastructure. And we also looked at 27 of our member countries' country partnership strategies. And over time, they have improved their focus on climate adaptation, and more recent ones have more adaptation indicators in their results frameworks, which is good. But you can see from the graph that a lot of our CPSs, our country partnership strategies, still do not have adaptation as the focus. In terms of targets, ADB did set an annual adaptation finance target of 2 billion by 2020. While we haven't been able to meet that, we did reach 1.5 billion in 2019. Integral to ADB's approach for adaptation is its climate risk management framework. And this mandates that all investments should be screened for climate risks, and then, as appropriate, the adaptation measures are developed and incorporated into design. So in terms of portfolio, I mean, one question might be, how do we define our adaptation portfolio? Well, ADB follows the multilateral development bank's harmonized approach for climate accounting. And you can see from the first donut diagram that, you know, our adaptation finance is dominated by three sectors: agriculture and natural resources, the transport sector, and urban water. And the lower donut diagram shows that South Asia was the biggest recipient of adaptation finance. Pacific was the lowest, but actually that number, that 6%, that's about half of all climate finance for the Pacific. So a much higher ratio than for the other regions, where typically adaptation was about 50%. So overall, ADB has supported over the decade 8.7 billion in adaptation finance, which represents about 22% of overall climate finance. Overall climate finance was 40 billion over the period. So moving on to performance and results, the portfolio is not very mature, but where we have completed and validated projects, the performance is quite strong. We dug a bit deeper in about 250 projects. We did identify some issues with design, particularly results frameworks need strengthening. Only a third of recent adaptation approvals had climate-related outcome indicators. I mentioned climate proofing was the main focus, and this was mainly delivered through structural measures. We did not see so much, except in recent approvals, the use of nature-based solutions. Technical assistance and policy-based lending are really important for enhancing our member countries' capacity to manage climate risks and to install the necessary reforms for more strategic adaptation planning. We also held a lot of focus groups with project beneficiaries. And while feedback was generally positive, they did highlight the importance of context and community engagement when designing adaptation solutions. So just one example, this is, you know, one challenge for doing this kind of evaluation during COVID is how to assess results. And this is one example of a project in Bangladesh where ADB was supporting the climate proofing of about 130 kilometers of roads, rural roads. And we used satellite radar. The three images represents flood inundation in the project areas during Cyclone Amphan. So it's before, during, and a week after Cyclone Amphan. And we were able to identify that almost all of the roads were clear of any inundation evidence a week after the cyclone. But I think we do need to use more of these kind of creative approaches to measure the impacts of adaptation approaches. So then just finally, some key takeaways. I mean, with the global accelerated pace of climate impacts, we need to urgently scale up action to improve resilience in the Asia-Pacific region. In our country strategies and programming, we need to make adaptation a priority so that our pipeline of projects feeds into improved resilience. Need to work upstream in and embed climate risk assessments in the private sector operations. That's one area where we had only less than 1% of our portfolio was from the private sector in adaptation. And we also need to focus more on tracking climate outcomes. And the best way to do this is we need to get indicators into the results frameworks of these investments. And then finally, we need to devote more attention to projects where adaptation is the primary objective. So sort of going beyond climate proofing. And in this case, technical assistance and policy-based lending will be quite important to get that multiplier effect. So I'll stop there, Andreas, but our evaluation, full evaluation is on our website, and Nathan, our director for this evaluation, is on the panel, and I'm happy to respond to any questions as well. Thanks, Andreas.
Thank you, Garrett. Thank you, Garrett. This has been excellent. And just to say, you know, this highlights some of the similarities that we found across the evaluations here at the GCF, but also at the Adaptation Fund. You've been talking about results and the question of looking at tracking climate outcomes, very similar to what we found there at the GCF, where we weren't sure how well results management frameworks are actually helping us in addressing this. Maybe we can come back to this then later with Nathan as well. And then technical assistance is obviously a key aspect. That's also something that the GCF and the IEU here at the GCF is thinking about as well. And that is really nice to know that you have similar reflections on innovation and on private sector. And I'm hoping to have a couple of comments from Archie in a short while. So without further ado, maybe can I invite our colleague again virtually to come in from ICRAF to tell us a little bit about how does that look like on the ground, and that would be over to Larissa from ICRAF.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andreas. You hear me well, yeah?
Excellent, excellent. We hear you all right. And thanks for coming on.
Good, thanks so much. It's almost 10 p.m. here in East Africa, so my light is a bit dark, but I think you can see me well. So in this event, specifically, I'll be talking about the lessons, which would be really more informative for some of us who are not really directly involved in the local level implementation, because we've been doing some activities in different countries, in the Gambia, Benin, currently also we are starting a process in Rwanda, Tanzania, and different countries involved in different GCF investments. So what I'll do is I'll only focus on some of these key lessons, not too much going into the technical details. From our understanding or from our experience, the first and the most important thing for adaptation outcomes to be more effective is it needs to be designed from an interconnected context. What is that meaning? We need to look at adaptation not from a single sector action plan or not from a single sector priority. It should be mainstreamed in a multi-sectoral approach. Because when you take a given landscape, you have water there where you need significant adaptation intervention. You have a forest there, you have agricultural land there, you have protected areas which serve biodiversity and different elements. So if you are only prioritizing one piece out of these many things, then you are missing a lot on the other aspects. So there is a need for us now to move beyond that sectoral approach to adaptation and embrace this multi-sectoral approach so that we reduce the trade-offs that emerge due to the different activities we undertake along the sectoral lines. So we need to make an emphasis on the systems approach to adaptation. The second point is, if you look at most of the adaptation actions we are taking at the moment, they are mostly focusing on the observed effects of climate change and variability, or the observed impacts or changes that we see within the climate variables. These are mostly reactive intervention designs, but we need to move beyond the reactive intervention designs towards a proactive intervention designs, where we need to look at the future trajectories of change within the climate variables so that we build that future and the current as one set and they move together. Why do we emphasize these reactive and also proactive measures? It is because if you look at environmental issues, most of them take a long time to mature. And if we don't build these things together, then one will begin to play against the other, or the trade-off between the current needs versus the long-term objectives becomes bigger, thereby hampering the adaptation outcomes we might achieve at a landscape or at a specific location. And the next point is really more about the realities on the field. This I can give you quite a number of examples, but let me just take one. Assume a project is approved in March, and then the rain comes in June. Between March and June, you have some few months, and then you have year one target of about which states that we have to restore 100 hectares of degraded forest. In reality, you don't have the time to actually materialize that target, the activities that could lead to these targets. And there is a big difference between when the project is approved, when the first activities start, and what target we have already set for the first year or the second year or so. What does this mean? It is about the realities on the ground should actually be part of the thinking process in approving the projects, in implementing the projects, and also in the monitoring processes. Especially if you look at the sub-Saharan Africa, in the Western African context, where you have a single rainy season. If you miss 1 month, there could be a big difference between what you achieve and what you can't achieve. So field realities should be part of the discourse all the time. They should be part of the thinking when we are looking at deliverables or targets or milestones for adaptation projects. And the next one is more looking into the people side of adaptation. I mean, adaptation, basically, it has to be involving people, it has to be involving the ecosystem. But here we want to emphasize the point that in the scaling agenda, people's choice matters a lot. Why do we say people's choice matters? Because we have seen in the field, for example, in the Gambia, where we are implementing one of the GCF projects, which is quite a pioneer in the continent, women preferred a different intervention action versus the men. And if we are not looking at the preferences or the choices that they are putting forward, the probability that that intervention will be scaled out once this project goes is quite low, because there is already a disagreement between the men and the women in terms of what should be implemented and what should not be implemented. So the design process, again, has to take this thing into account. And again, this leads me to the next point. That is, we need comprehensive scaling strategies if we have to ensure that adaptation investments yield sustainable impacts on the ground. What do we mean by this? If you look at so many of the projects we have, there is always that commitment. I can put it in the quotation mark, commitment, where it is stated that the government, after the project phases out, will take activities to the next level or continue implementing some of these activities. But these commitments normally are not deliberately accompanied by resources that are required to implement those commitments. And very often, that's why we see, as soon as the project phases out, all the actions phase out. Then all the investment is gone. And it is a short-term investment, huge investment probably, but then suddenly there is a stoppage time where everything comes to be stagnant because local communities do not have the capacity to move that action forward to that level that is required for them to adapt. And the resource they have couldn't actually induce the level of change that is required for them to sufficiently adapt to the climate attributes that are out there due to the various things. Before I finalize, one point is the need for knowledge blending. Very often we rely on scientific knowledge, which is derived from prediction, projection, trend analysis, and all these things. That's very good, that's very critical. But at the same time, when we think about adaptation, it is also critical to look at the local ecological knowledge and also traditional practices that are out there that people in the landscapes have been practicing, so that the two, the scientific knowledge and the local ecological knowledge or traditional practices, form a bigger package that we take forward. In that case, we embrace the people's priorities, the people's experiences. At the same time, we bring in the scientific perspectives that define the actions. Next is the issue around capacity. It has already been said, but there is a very critical need to invest in infrastructures and human capacity, especially in the sub-Saharan context, where there is a lot of already some consensus that there will be a significant effect from changing climate variables like temperature and rainfall variabilities that will be coming forth in the next decades or so. So if we don't prepare now, if we don't invest in these things now through the various projects that are coming, then in the future there will be an issue. Who will take it forward, using what resource, and what is the basis for that resource in terms of the infrastructural support that is needed? At the end of the day, people should be at the center stage of the adaptation planning, because what we are really doing is nudging people's behavior towards a nature positive action so that we are prospering the ecosystem at the same time prospering the people. And what do we mean by this? Because in sub-Saharan African context, or broadly in the developing nations, land-based activities are the main sources of livelihood. So managing our ecosystems is the critical component. So we need to influence people so that their behaviors are always nature positive or proactive in terms of protecting their ecosystems that generate ecosystem goods and services that are the basis of the adaptation attributes we are looking forward to. And in general, I think there are key things that we still need to be looking at in terms of barriers, in terms of lessons. But I think because of time, these are just the ones I prioritized for the moment based on our experiences. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Larissa. Thank you again. Really rich to hear from you and hear this context as well from the ground, as you said it. It's very rich what you said. Just to say, you know, the question of interconnected contexts and systems thinking resonates very much with what the IEU has tried to do with looking at complex systems and how we are finding ourselves right now in this at this point in time where we have the human climate interaction that's basically bringing together two complex systems and forming a new one, which puts us in front of interesting and very interesting and exciting challenges ahead on how to evaluate such system later on. Sustainability, you mentioned, it's also a question of how sustainable are projects at the end. Sustainability is one of the evaluation criteria that's been most contested with the OECD DAC criteria, but also here at the IEU, when we had the discussion about evaluation criteria for the GCF, evaluation policy has just been passed. I know others are working on evaluation policies as well at the Adaptation Fund. So you see, this is obviously very, very well connected to several discussions that we have as evaluation officers across the globe and across different climate funds. Which brings me to the climate fund that's sitting here with us, the Adaptation Fund, and the technical evaluation group here. I'm really pleased to have you both, and I'll give it over to you for a brief introduction of your take on what does it mean to be in such a coherent and a coherent place of different climate funds. What does it mean from your perspective, given that you're also a fairly new player here with us? So we're really, really excited to hear from you. Over.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you for that very warm welcome and introduction. And we're very pleased to be here today at this event. I'm Debbie Menezes. I'm the chair of the Adaptation Fund's Technical Evaluation Reference Group, and I'm here with my colleague who will introduce himself as well, Claudio. So it's just, one of the advantages of going later on is that you see all the good points have already been made. And so I'm going to try and reinforce those. And also, I think what is emerging is a common thread. It's great to know that we're all saying, the same sorts of things, and there are some nuggets that are emerging, and I think that opens the path for us to continue this conversation. So could you put my first slide on, please? Thank you. Right, so there's one, that's one before that. Yeah, two before that. Yes. The reason we wanted to put this slide up is just to kind of emphasize that we are at a very early stage in our learning, very early since, we've only been in operation for about 2 years in the fund. We're independent, and therefore what we're sharing today is some of our very early learnings and reflections. The next slide. Thank you. So just in terms of who we are, so the Adaptation Fund, as you may know, the main thrust of the Adaptation Fund is to help developing countries build resilience and adapt to climate change. And the orange bit, which is us, the Technical Evaluation Reference Group, what we call ourselves fondly the AF-TERG, we're an independent evaluation unit, but we are functionally independent, but obviously linked very much to the Adaptation Fund. We've been operational, as I said, since 2019, so we're very young. And we have a multi-year work program, and we have done some foundational work. Now, the Adaptation Fund itself has about 850 million for climate adaptation, which is maybe, it's growing as well, so that's quite significant that the portfolio is growing and evolving. There are over 123 concrete adaptation projects, and the fund has been a pioneer in climate adaptation financing. And our role as the TERG, AF-TERG, is mainly to develop evaluation products, to look at some oversight functions. So we provide guidance, and we also ensure an advisory services, which is essentially, any findings and recommendations, we reflect those back to the board. And we've got a fourth one in there, which is strategic collaboration, which is really within the fund, with the fund's stakeholders across countries, but also with other like-minded stakeholders outside. It's important for us. So the next slide, please. So earlier on, when we were formed, we thought, okay, let's do some foundational work and see what we're up against. What have we got here? And if you see, the first row has got some lessons on there. So there are 3 lessons. The green blobs, which appears green, yep. Those are some of the challenges that we identified. And then the bits at the bottom are what we're doing in response to that. So we did some foundational studies. And one of the first learnings was ensure a fit-for-purpose monitoring, evaluation, and learning approach that grasps the urgency of climate change and is responsive to the context. This was a really critical learning for us because, as you know, climate change is a wicked problem. We know that the causes are multiple and they're complex. We know that the impacts are uncertain, and that we're also, there are so many different ways in which you can potential solutions to take forward. So we realize that any monitoring, evaluation, and learning approach cannot be linear. It cannot just go one step at a time because things are changing. It's all uncertain. Contexts vary across countries, across sectors, and there's uncertainty, as I said. So what we've recently done, the fund has a medium-term, 5-year medium-term strategy, and we have done a midterm review of that strategy. And this is important because the strategy actually sets out the overall approach for the fund. So it's really important to understand, how that's on track and how our portfolio and our evaluation approach is aligned with that. We're also developing, as you mentioned, Andreas, a new evaluation policy that's in draft at the moment and in consultation. And that's more reflective of the fund's overall needs, as well as looking at the external context of climate change adaptation, where that's going, and MEL thinking, how that's advancing. Because the previous evaluation framework was done in 2012, and the world has changed since then. So we needed to refresh this evaluation policy, and hence that's in progress. And the third area under that first pillar is demand side. So we're not just supply-driven people. We don't just churn out evaluation products, but we also think it's really important, and I think one of the speakers alluded to that. It's about capacity building of stakeholders. It's about ensuring that our evaluation work is responsive to the needs of all the stakeholders. The second lesson is around new approaches to harnessing and using quality data. As you all know, data quality is a big issue. The robustness of data, the time lags, a project finishes and then is it going to sustain? How do you know what the impacts are? Looking beyond the indicators, because the indicators will only give you a small window into what's happening, but what happens beyond that. And then there are new concepts which many people are grappling with on resilience, on sustainability, and how do you tackle those? So for the fund itself, we've recently done some work on ex-post evaluations. And by this, I mean, projects finish, and then what happens 3 to 5 years later. And we found through our foundational work that not many organizations perhaps devote as much resources to looking at what the impacts of any interventions are in 5 years' time. What's sustained, what hasn't. And then what do you look at in terms of resilience and sustainability? So we've just developed some guidance looking at that, looking at resilience, at transformative change and sustainability, and we're piloting that. So it's a process of learning, and we hope that that will be available more widely. We're also then looking at some thematic evaluations, and this is very much focused on innovative features of the fund. As I said, we're at such an early stage that our work is not at the project level, it's more at the fund level, at the operational level. And then the third lesson, and I think speakers have alluded to this as well, is the need for a values-based approach. Now, I'd like to, evaluators are often seen as the sort of police, who come in and say, have you done your, what's the impact? And we're not, we're trying to get away from that particular image. It's not a bunch of tools and systems, but it's a service, I think, and that's really important in terms of, thinking about evaluation as a service and about something that can add value to programs as they're going forward. And so where I've got active versus passive, we see beneficiaries not as passive recipients of a project, but as active participants, and that's really important. It's really important to think about lessons for adaptive management so that you can take corrective action as you're going along. And learning loops are also important. So, you learn, you adjust, you go forward, not just learning within a project, but also learning across countries. So south-to-south collaboration, for instance, might be a really good way of learning. And we have developed, the AF-TERG has developed some principles that embody some of these MEL values, as we call it. And then we're also promoting learning and knowledge to support adaptive action within the fund. So let me stop there and hand over to Claudio. Thank you.
Great. So good evening, everyone. It is really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I hope you're enjoying all these very interesting learnings and highlights of the work that evaluators do around the world. And I wanted to focus, if you can put the next slide, I wanted to go a little bit deeper into one of the works that we did recently at the Adaptation Fund. So as Debbie mentioned, the Adaptation Fund has a pretty unique feature, if you wish, in the climate landscape. In 2018, it started the medium-term strategy, which is that circle up in the left side of the screen. And it has 3 pillars: learning, action, and innovation. So that was the focus of our midterm review, which we just completed. In October, we made a presentation to the board of the Adaptation Fund, and it was well received, in particular because the current medium-term strategy will end in 2022, and in 2022 the fund will go through the process of developing the next strategy. So this midterm review, one of the key objectives was to support the next section. So I'm not going to go into all of the many findings and many recommendations that we had. A lot of them are very specific to the fund. It is available in our website if you're interested. We took an approach of trying to look at a strategy as a strategy. So we did a lot of analysis. Is this a strategy fit for purpose? Does it follow the good practices of what a strategy should be? So one of the key it was a key finding and conclusion that we reached. It's like, given what we decided to call it the burning platform, meaning the crisis, the climate crisis that we have at hand, plus, of course, the COVID pandemic, we concluded a fund such as the Adaptation Fund is definitely more needed and relevant than ever. So the fund has created an experience of quick funding, the whole concept of direct accreditation and direct implementing entities. Also, the issue that they're focusing in very concrete adaptation actions. So that has created sort of a niche of the fund. The medium-term strategy, the MTS, has not only increase and expand and focus the niche of the fund, but also gave the fund an opportunity to expand, going beyond the concrete actions into 2 new areas, let's say, which were innovation and knowledge management and knowledge and learning. So that was, we concluded that definitely the medium-term strategy provided that clarity and expansion. One of the things that the fund has done is has created 7 new windows of funding that go into innovation, knowledge, enhanced direct access, readiness. So that is giving the fund a more expansive mandate. One surprising, I think, to us was that many of these funds and many of the people that interact with the climate funds, there is a tendency of uneasiness, or I will say complaints about all the compliance that they have to go through to get funding, a project approved. But we found that in the case of the Adaptation Fund, at least, 2 of the key policies and standards, both gender and the environment and social policy, push the entities, many of the direct, in particular the national entities, to improve the quality of the project. So we found that the quality of the projects were much better because of the compliance with those 2 policies, which was kind of surprising to us. So thinking about a little bit of the kind of some reflections also on what the midterm review came up. It was obvious that, and I think the COP now has been discussing a lot about financing, and the Adaptation Fund is probably one of the ones that suffers the most of not having a clear replenishment process. Remember, the Adaptation Fund was created by the Kyoto Protocol, so with the idea that there was going to be this, it was going to follow the carbon market. That is not been working so much. So the Adaptation Fund doesn't have a clear financing flow. So there were several countries in the last few days that have pledged and has said that they will donate to the fund. But imagine trying to program without a certainty on how much money you actually have, with great need from many countries. So that was one of the key reflections and challenges, to say, that we saw. Now, also, the new windows that the fund created, in particular the innovation one, created some problems on trying to define what innovation was. And in particular, because these innovation projects were small projects that were reaching new individuals, new entities, working, the locally based communities, that they're not necessarily involved in all the climate lingo that we are familiar with. So they were not understanding what innovation and climate adaptation was. So that created some delays, although there's a huge interest, and there's a big pipeline of projects coming into those new windows. The third and I think Victoria, it was kind of interesting to recognize a similarity and a finding, is the whole issue of innovation and risk. So obviously, when you bring innovative projects, you need to assume some risk. But our conclusion was that, and it's not only with the Adaptation Fund, but I think many of the funds have yet to couple with and understand what do they mean by risk, and how the risk appetite of those organizations. And we can talk more about it offline if you want to, but there's a lot about the way these funds are set up. So on one hand, you incentivize innovation, but on the other hand, you're like, oh, don't be too risky because we need to be successful. So instead of also learning from those things that haven't worked, and I think we have not opened the space, we call it, let's say, a safe space where we can discuss things that they haven't worked and take the lessons from it. And I think that was something that the fund, the Adaptation Fund, is still kind of dealing with, and I think is an opportunity for the next medium-term strategy to define the level of riskiness. The final point is, and I think is very relevant to the people sitting here and also in the panel, is that the whole concept of complementarity and coherence. Of course, this is part of the DNA of the COP, so it's very important. But and I think the climate funds are finally talking to each other, but they're still talking about programming and operations. But the people sitting in this panel are not yet talking, and I think in the evaluation space we need to do a lot more work. In particular, when you look at it from a client point of view, the burden that we create on the small Ministry of Environment of a small island state, you can imagine when you have 5 or 6 different funds coming in, all of them with different standards on evaluation and results measurements, and so it is quite a huge burden. So going forward, we of course had made, like every evaluation, there are many recommendations, but I just wanted to bring 2 in particular. One is that because of the way adaptation is usually discussed in the context also of the COPs, is this, and I think somebody was talking about, I think Larissa was talking about integration and multi-sector. So there's kind of a line that divides adaptation from other aspects of development. And I think the Adaptation Fund has been short in claiming a lot of things that they're doing because of this framework of results that we are strictly reporting on resilience, which is, of course, the mandate of the fund. But because of the type of projects that we do, there's a lot more other results on, empowering women, empowering youth, local benefits, jobs. And the final point relates also to our work, and I think also Victoria was bringing the issue of, we're still not sure how to identify a successful adaptation project. So. And that's a very important issue right now, given of the necessity of starting to implement and give solutions to the people, because adaptation is happening now. I mean, it's not something that we can continue to do research. So I think we need to, as an evaluation community, we need to support better on how to measure success so it can be replicated and scale up. That's, I think we're still sort of struggling to, when you see it, we know it, but we still don't know if we can see it. Basically, because we need to still wait maybe 30 years into the future. So,
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudio. This is Debbie, Claudio, thank you once again. Just to summarize, there's lots that's very, very much indeed overlapping what we are thinking, what ADB is thinking, what DEval may be thinking as well, and we hear of that in a second. There are many parts to the story on questioning what are we doing with our risk appetite? How are we understanding a risk appetite as a climate fund in a space where we working together, at least as the GCF, also working together with the private sector, or supposed to work together with the private sector in adaptation. We've heard from the ADB as well as from our side that the private sector investments are not there where they should be, in particular in a space where a lot of needs are put forward, and that those are climate needs and climate adaptation needs that are put forward. But then also this element of learning and knowledge management. And as you said, and I've been sitting in the morning, I've been sitting in a panel at IFAD, at the pavilion in IFAD, and what struck me there was somebody said, look, learning is fine, but we can say multiple times and a million times we have learned, but what are we going to do with it? And it's this action that would follow through after the learning that needs to happen. And you said it very well, Claudio. It's also one of the first opportunities here to talk to each other, with each other, about what we've learned. And I think this is why we wanted to do this event here. And also hearing as well people from the ground with Larissa, but also our friends from ADB who are still joined here virtually, but not in the room, so you can't see them at the moment. But so let me phrase this again. So innovation, risk, but also private sector. I have here with me, and we have here with us Archie from the IEU, who has been task lead for the evaluation on the private sector. There were really interesting findings that were very pertinent for the question on adaptation. So Archie, take it away. Only a couple of minutes, 3 minutes or so, because we're really struck for time. We also got our friend from DEval here now.
Thanks, Andreas. I'll be very brief. I'll just point you to some of the findings, some of the key findings from an evaluation we concluded in September. And so it's really fresh on the private approach of the GCF to the private sector. One of the key findings we had from that evaluation was that the GCF in its architecture does not sufficiently make the distinction between catalyzing on the one hand and mobilizing on the other. So currently the emphasis is on, and currently actually there's no distinction, but the emphasis seems to be on leverage and mobilizing, in which and a government that was anyway going to make investments in climate projects, that's counted as leverage. Instead, we are proposing that the GCF should be in a space where it takes risk. It acts as a public institution, which it is, to take risks and to go into areas such as adaptation to make them attractive, to identify sectors and geographies where private sector would otherwise not go. So that's one. The second is that the private sector portfolio of the GCF, the country ownership of it, and we've spoken of the priorities of stakeholders, can be strengthened. And that link is still tenuous. Part of that reason is that the private sector priorities of countries themselves are not sufficiently clear or strong, and the GCF needs to support countries in identifying the priorities related to private sector and also with adaptation and private sector together. The third thing that I wanted to speak very quickly about is that the mandate of the GCF when it comes to the private sector makes mention of several things, which include local actors and small and medium enterprises, which includes SIDS and LDCs, and adaptation. In all of these areas, the portfolio of the GCF is quite limited, especially when it comes to the private sector. And this portfolio needs to be corrected, especially for local actors and MSMEs. And we're recommending a couple of things. One is for the board to clarify and for the GCF to clarify that it's a catalyzing fund, not a leverage fund necessarily. Speed has to improve. There's no surprises that the GCF is a slow institution, like many other public institutions, but GCF is characteristically so, and that has to improve. country ownership of the private sector portfolio has to increase, and we're making several recommendations on that dimension, and that the portfolio should correct itself for the use of instruments, and sometimes private sector portfolio will have to use grant-based instruments to be catalytic and to create enabling environments, particularly for adaptation. So I'll stop there, Andreas.
Thanks, Archie. Thanks once again. Great to hear these contexts as well. We've got with us Dr. Sven Harten here from the Deputy Director of the German Institute for Development Evaluation. So we're really, really pleased to have him as well. He's not coming from a climate fund, but Germany has been notorious for strong investments in that space. So we wanted to have him as well come and share some lessons on recent evaluations, in particular with reference to climate and climate adaptation. So Sven, I'll give you my microphone. We're running out of microphones. We are a lot of people here on stage. Over to you.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you for having me, and apologies for coming late. You know, like at least once at COP, I wanted to feel like really, really important, especially with such esteemed colleagues being here. You know, like coming late, saying, "Well, I'm so busy. I've been at." Anyway, so it's true. I wasn't having a cigarette. I came from a different session. Anyway, thanks for having me. So. For those of you, and that's probably the majority who don't know, so DEval is Germany's official institute with the mandate to evaluate its bilateral development cooperation. So we have a big task, and even though we're growing and growing, Germany's development cooperation has been growing as well. So over the last 3 years, we've been working on an evaluation on climate change adaptation. This will run for another year, and some key findings I wanted to share with you is that actually I have a PowerPoint, but no, it's easy enough to understand without PowerPoint. So the first one, the good news that my colleagues in Germany really liked is that Germany pledged. Oh yeah, there it even is. Wow, you guys are amazing. On this one, okay. Yeah, that's the evaluation. So what I wanted to show first is we did a portfolio analysis. Germany pledged to spend 4 billion per year. At the time they pledged it, people in the ministry said, oh, how are we going to ever spend that money? Good news is they are spending it. Interestingly, though, I mean, the graphs are a little bit confusing, but still, proportionally, overall Germany's bilateral cooperation grew a bit more than what they're spending on climate. I mean, it's not as big a difference as it shows there. I messed up the PowerPoint. If you get it from SPSS, then no, from Stata, it's better. But still, I mean, it's an ambitious target to spend 4 billion. But looking at the overall growth of development cooperation in Germany, you know, you might ask yourself, well, could have they been doing a bit better? Those are the key sectors, nothing really surprising there. Water, agriculture, environmental protection. This one is cool. So we used a tool that looked at the priorities in the NDCs, and we matched it with Germany's funding. And what we saw is that, well, the good news is, again, there's a big overlap in terms of national priorities as specified in the NDG and NDCs and where the money goes. However, it's only, for the best of cases, it's only 57%. So you do have, you know, depends whether you're an evaluator and the glass is half empty or you're an operations guy and it's half full. It's 57%, so you can interpret the way how you want that. Another one here, that map. So, you know, I'm a political scientist. I'm not a climate expert. But for me, as sort of a naive person, I'm thinking, well, vulnerability should be sort of one of the key determinant factors where the money goes, right? What we see is, again, the good news to my German colleagues is that yes, it goes to vulnerable countries. The not so good news is that the more vulnerable a country gets doesn't mean that they get more funding. So this is what you see, the yellow and the oranges are countries that we, from a regression analysis, would expect to be receiving more funding looking at their vulnerability level. And then the blue ones, they're receiving more than we would expect. So again, you know, it's sort of nuances how you want to interpret this. But for me, as sort of a non-expert in this area, this was quite a surprising finding. Last one, you know, if you're a bilateral donor, you're spending 4 billion a year. I would expect, you know, that you spend at least some of the money to go into the hard places, to go in the SIDS. Oh, actually, the SIDS is one of the places completely left out in the previous slide. But I would be wondering, you know, wouldn't you go into the more difficult places? Well, what we see here is that, well, maybe Germany is doing it right, and I would be interested to hear from you, but they're going into the places where you have lots of other donors being present and tendentially the larger countries. So maybe, again, you know, a question for the discussion, but what we saw from the portfolio analysis, it's, it might be an issue of donor concentration, or it might be just going into the right places. So that's just a quick run through.
Thank you, Sven. This is indeed insightful and a little bit enticing on discussions that one could have about ways on how to go into spaces and how to how should I put it? How to look strategically at where to invest into the portfolio. So that's been really quite insightful. Thank you again for coming on and having this discussion with us. Look, we are at the end of the presentations. I would want to first bring it to the audience here that we have in the room to see if there's any questions that you'd like to have. I'll hand over my mic. And then we have a couple of questions. That would be great. Other than that, we would start with a brief panel discussions. We're running a little bit out of time, so we would be doing maybe a couple of questions if you have any to hear in the audience. Thank you. Just state your name.
Sure. Yes, hi. Some of you I know, some I don't. David McCauley from WWF, but also I was part of the evaluation period for the ADB from 2011. 2 years of those, I was climate director, so I was also being evaluated. But my question has to do with this sort of ubiquitous fundamental metric of numbers of vulnerable people affected, and directly and indirectly, and then how one would measure if they actually were made more resilient. Did any of your evaluations shed some light on that metric that perhaps would help us tighten that up? Thank you.
Cheers, thank you. Really great to have you here. We'll take another one and then we'll go into the round. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Marek Sohns from the International Institute for Environment Development. And maybe just, can I just sneakily add on to that? And just ask a second question. Just to add on to that, I guess it'd be really interesting to hear on the top of that around opportunities for actually, rather than going just to vulnerable groups, to those that have been excluded, but also we know it's hard to measure in 30 years' time, to actually thinking about how much power do those excluded people actually have over the adaptation resources that they receive. And then my actual question was on the risk appetite. I'd just be really interested to hear some examples of what that actually looks like, because when we've actually looked at the portfolios, we see a tendency for intentions to be risky with the private sector and to be willing to invest in projects that often don't have good theories of change. But when you actually want to invest in projects that are bottom up and are based on governance structures rather than necessarily a list of projects that you don't know what's going to happen because we don't know how to adapt, it tends to be a lot of risk aversion, and we don't want to invest in them because we want perfect information. So it was just interesting to know, can we give better guidance to secretariats and boards about how actually to be risky for vulnerable communities? So.
Cheers, thank you. So these have been really interesting questions. I would like to give it first to our colleagues on ADB who joined online just to go a little bit deeper into this question of measurement. And we're very well aware, I think all our organizations have had that trouble. So Nathan, I hope you're still with us. If you could come on and talk a little bit about your experience with measurement, what does it mean to reach 1 million beneficiaries? Is that a good measure? Is it not? What do we learn?
Yeah, thank you, Andreas, and let me take that question a little bit in a broader way, right? And talk a little bit more broadly in terms of how adaptation finance has been accounted for. One of the key constraints and challenge that we face in ADB is this harmonized approach that is there among MDBs to account for adaptation finance is a lot more onerous than how the accounting for mitigation finance happens. For example, on adaptation finance, it's the incremental cost that gets counted as adaptation finance to address climate vulnerabilities, right? And as a result, a small portion of the project cost only gets counted for adaptation finance, whereas for mitigation finance, the entire project cost gets counted, even though the benefits that accrue from those projects in some instances are much lower. So we see that there is a problem in the way the accounting happens, and that is also sort of related to the question that was asked, which is, what is the risk appetite and how are projects being selected based on risk appetite? Because, one of the things that we see happening in ADB is there is an increasing focus on structural solutions, right, rather than non-structural and nature-based solutions. And the reason why that is happening partly is because nature-based solutions are highly risky. Benefits cannot be properly quantified and reported on. And staff are incentivized to meet budgets on climate finance. And structural interventions are cost intensive, and hence staff are more inclined to do structural interventions. Whereas the more risky interventions like nature-based solutions, which will address vulnerable communities and will be a lot more engaged with the community at the ground level, are not done because they make projects a lot more complex, not only to design but also to manage. And so this is a key constraint that we face, and what I'm going to say is also going to resonate with what others have said, which is a key ingredient to address this is to improve capacity on the ground, right, and use policy and technical assistance interventions that are going to have huge demonstration effects so as to improve capacity for line ministries and staff in line ministries, so as to engage in activities to create projects that are amenable for nature-based interventions that can be financed by MDBs such as ADB. So I think both sides need to come together on this, and also thinking out of the box, right, in terms of solutions, because people have alluded to this is on the private sector engagement, which is the reason why private sector doesn't want to engage is because there is most of the adaptation projects don't have a revenue stream and are not profitable. And if and when the revenue happens in adaptation projects, these are very back-ended, and private sector doesn't want to get involved when their capital is committed for a long period of time and they don't get a return until several years down the road. And so I think the way to address this is to make sure that there is proper risk mitigation products that happen with to reduce the cost upfront. One of the things that ADB did was to ensure carbon credits are paid upfront, right, for emissions that were certified emissions that could happen in the future, emission reductions. And so those are all examples of blended finance solutions that could happen where you reduce the cost upfront and you try to encourage private sector to come in. But I would almost say that compared to the public side and the private side, it should be the public side that should take more of the risk. And once the project is well demonstrated and can be replicated and mainstreamed, I think that is when private sector is really going to come in. So hopefully this provided some kind of a perspective in terms of where we stand, but we do very little projects at the community level. Much of our projects are infrastructure heavy, structural solutions, and we do very little on the private sector side for adaptation. Much of it has been on the public side.
Excellent, excellent, Nathan. This sounds indeed very interesting. Once more on this question of measurement, but also taking it on for the risk. I would want to turn this question right away to the Adaptation Fund, because you even mentioned it in one of your slides. This question of how measurement is still something that's a bit vague, or where learning opportunities are there. So Claudio, maybe over to you.
I mean, I don't have necessarily an answer, but there are methodologies, of course, and each of the funds, defined beneficiary in a different way. Most of them, I would say, is similar, and you count. You've done projects. I'm sure you have faced this. Do you count how many people go to a workshop or how many people click on your website? I mean, and you see the whole spectrum of counting all of that. There's definitely there's no agreement between the different climate funds. In my previous life, when I used to work in IFC, I used to lead a program that it was the harmonized indicators for private sector, which imagine trying to push all of these big institutions, both public and private, to talk about how do you define jobs and how do you define even beneficiaries. But I think if you want to make it even more interesting, you have a multiple donor to a project, and each of them claim the 10 beneficiaries. So at the end of the day, you have 20 or 30 beneficiaries when you add all of these, claims of all of the different donors. So it's quite, I mean, to me, what it makes sense is that we need to have more of a talk between the funds to try to understand and make clarity on how do you define it. On the other hand, it is a very nice, very relatively easy communication, from a communication point of view, through this, the fund has touched so many people, that is a very good communication message. But then, right now there's no validation. There's a self-reporting, meaning the entities complete, when you prepare the project, you put a target, of course a baseline, you put a target, and then throughout an annual report, you report how many of your beneficiaries you've touched, and that's the end of the story. So yes, I think most of the evaluations will kind of move away from that, because we know that it's not the most interesting number. So you will rarely see an evaluation, going deep into the lessons and did it work or not on counting beneficiaries, because to us that's very much an output. Until you see the change in behavior, it doesn't become that interesting from an evaluation point of view. Yeah. So anyway.
Claudio, very, very nice and very relevant. I think I'd like to park this question for 1 second, but it's interesting to see that we need to think about innovations in design and methods for evaluations, particularly also in post-COVID. We need to address this. We need to think about that. Let me ask this question to Larissa, but also to Archie in a second. Let me just, before we go onto this question, let me just also hear from the German perspective and from DEval's perspective on risk and on the private sector, because that is something that you also have been looking at. So let me give it to you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know, perhaps I'll make myself terribly unpopular, but like when I hear all this talk about private sector engagement and the work on structured funds, right, part of blended finance. In our experience and in our evaluation evidence, blended finance, especially structured funds, are not always the best tools. for adaptation. Why? Because you set up a fund, you set up a relatively complicated structure of who takes the risks, and then investors buy into this at point A, in year one. Those funds run, well, some don't have an end date. They usually run for many, many, many years. And so that means that structure has been set up with priorities. What happens when, and we saw that in Latin America, when countries changed their national priorities, those funds are not very good in reacting to this. So we looked at, it's sort of the borderline, between adaptation and loss and damage or residual risk. We looked at some funds specifically with insurance, and some of the older ones had problems of taking on board those new national priorities because how would they sell those new risk structures to the investors? So that's one challenge, and the other one is just many investors said, well, you know what, those 3-tier structure is too complicated for us. And, for some proportion of our money, we want to take some more risk. And, why don't you get away with this mezzanine tranche that makes it all too complicated? We can't really sell it to our investors. So, I personally really believe in blended finance and in structured funds, but for some parts of what we're talking about now here, adaptation, and also what is coming beyond adaptation, residual risk loss, it's not perfect and the best tool always. Thank you.
That's interesting, yeah. Look, from this perspective, and since we were talking about beneficiaries and now the question of private sector, let me ask this question back to ADB and Nathan, to you on transformation. We're all out there for the paradigm shift, for the transformational aspects of our work, and how can we assess and help to look at a far more transformative way into adaptation. So any feedback on that? Perhaps also, if you could, we had this path question on methods. Anything that you could share in that regard in what we're learning post-COVID? What sort of methods are becoming far more important? And help us perhaps look at that impact that we were talking about that we can't reach yet. Over to you, Nathan.
Sorry, Andreas. I had an issue with my internet connection.
Sure.
Can you repeat that question
again? Absolutely, with pleasure. Look, we were just talking about beneficiaries. We then heard from Sven about the private sector and his position on this. We were just now thinking a little bit more about transformational change and how we can help to support this. What's needed. Perhaps even from an evaluation perspective, what sort of alternative methods we may be using in the future to look at such questions, transformation and adaptation?
Right. Let me, before I answer that, this is something we looked at as part of our evaluation on ways we can be transformational in terms of adaptation solutions. I want to just provide a comment on blended finance solutions for adaptation. Right, I agree with Sven that it is very complicated because you're putting a lot of bells and whistles, and at the end of the day, it becomes too difficult to manage. And any structure that is way too difficult to manage will never succeed. But the other side of the coin is adaptation cannot be funded entirely from the public side. Ultimately, if this has to be a lasting solution on the ground, it has to be mainstreamed and private sector has to engage. And that is the only way we can have huge impact around the world, if the private sector money can be encouraged to participate. And I think for that to happen, we have to make sure that structures are done in a simplistic way, and that, more importantly, incentive mechanisms are set up so that all stakeholders that are involved in the transactions win. Private sector can only participate if all the stakeholders win. It has to be a win-win-win scenario. And people will have to be able to lose money as well, depending on certain thresholds not being met. And if those conditions are put in place, I think ultimately private sector solutions and blended finance solutions will succeed. But I agree, it's very complicated. Now, going to your question, Andreas, on the transformation approaches, right? Let me highlight a couple of things, right? One is, policy-based assistance and technical assistance support, right, have proven to be highly transformative in terms of ADB engagement, right? I'll give you a couple of examples. ADB did a climate risk assessment for a country in Eastern Asia to build a climate resilience toolkit. Right, this was a touch-based tool, very easy to use, and this was finally adopted by a lot of local policymakers to do their climate risk assessments, and was used as part of their urban and investment planning. So you can see how these solutions that are done at the region, country level have a huge multiplier effect, right? Rather than at the project level, which is at a particular small area of intervention, whereas these projects that are done and are adopted by the local policymakers can have a huge multiplier effect. Another example is ADB worked on doing a multi-hazard risk atlas map for the Maldives, right? And this is very useful for policymakers to understand climate risk and geophysical hazards that they can employ to do urban planning and investments. And again, you can see how transformative it can be in the future when it's sustained, right, over a long period of time. Another transformative solution that I was going to talk about today, which is very much in the news now, right, is building resilience in energy systems and in energy utilities, right? We all know, energy utilities are going through a crisis at this point, right? It's happening in Europe where, because of lack of reliability of wind as a source of renewable power, there's been huge disruptions in power supply, right? And as a result, there is increased reliance on natural gas to come in and plug the gap. And we all see now that the natural gas prices have all gone through the roof, and the price of power is tremendously increasing for the end user. And in some countries now, people have even switched back to using coal, right, to fill the gap. And so important benefits that have accrued in the last few years to transition away from fossil fuel has in fact been lost in last year and this year, right? And so to alleviate the situation, what needs to happen is and to have a transformational change is for government and policymakers to intervene and build resilience in energy utilities, right? Energy utilities in all the countries are right now operating on a very efficient basis. They don't have excess capacity. Now, resilience in energy utilities need to be compensated. And that is an important intervention, adaptive intervention that needs to be done by the public side that can really have a transformative effect even on the private sector side. Part of the solution would also be about integrating the grid systems and coming up with a proper trading scheme for power on a regional basis and across countries, right? And all these are measures that can have huge transformation effects, and these are adaptation measures, resilience measures for energy utility and energy systems.
Thanks, Nathan. Excellent. Again, it becomes very clear that we need to think about how this will be measurable, what sort of measures we need to put in place, and how at the same time the adaptation space is forming itself to have measures that are also in line with the, so to speak, theory of change of that process. Look, I'm cognizant of time. I'm just going to loop in Larissa because he must have been waiting all along for his intervention here a second time around. Larissa, if you're still with us, you've been speaking about this question of mainstreaming approaches and the need for a mainstreamed approach, and we've been speaking about measurement. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what sort of, from your perspective, what's needed to truly have that transformational change in the adaptation space? What are the key things that we might need to look at from an evaluation perspective? Maybe you can enlighten us a little bit on that once more. to the end of this wonderful session here. Larissa, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks so much, Andreas.
Thank you so much. Over to you.
It's quite an exciting session, and I'm really enjoying listening to the discussion. But I mean, listening to the ADB colleagues and also Dave, one thing is striking me. It's about, okay, what is driving these funding mechanisms? After all, the main goal is to have resilient communities, to have better adaptation outcomes. But to get to that, we have challenges. And as Nathan mentioned, because of these measurement challenges or the ways to derive the outcomes or to interpret the outcomes, they more often tend to focus on structural adaptation interventions. But the most important part of this whole narrative is we are leaving aside the nature-based solutions because they are complex to assess, to monitor, to measure. But in reality, when you look at a system-level resilience, not just about the people, but also about the ecosystem, you actually prioritize that system, that nature-based solutions as part of the whole adaptation framework. And I'm thinking, okay, should we revisit this issue so that we have that prioritization in a way accommodative of the complexity we have in the nature-based solutions part, as well as the simplicity we have in the structural investment zones or in investment areas? Because if you think about a sub-Saharan African context, if we are not investing in nature-based solutions, or if we don't manage the land, if we don't manage the forests, if we don't manage the landscapes, literally the community automatically will begin to become vulnerable. That vulnerability is not just about a single individual or 10% of the community. It gradually becomes holistic vulnerability where you begin to be challenged on what to do and what not to do. So this, for me, the foundation has to be revisited. I mean, this is really more a technical perspective of looking at these things. The foundation of these funding mechanisms has to be revisited if we have to really make the impact at a larger scale from a systems perspective. Because for us, the priority is if the system is resilient, if there is that level of reduction of vulnerability within the system. When we say the system, it is about the people, it's about the soil, it's about the water, it's about the plants, the biodiversity. If we don't look at it from that holistic perspective, we have not that much reduced the vulnerability, because we may help people in some ways doing some structural things, which is very good, which is very important as a short-term measure that could be very good and is a right investment. But how long will it take us? Or will we keep discussing about similar issues re-emerging because we left out some keys of the intervention areas that could have actually created complementarity with the structural adaptation interventions?
Thank you.
So that's why I'm just thinking and re-looking at these points. And maybe we can have further discussions beyond this session. That would be interesting for me, really.
Excellent.
So when you say what do we measure or how do we measure or what is transformational? Transformation literally, in my opinion, is context specific. If you go to the Sahel, where you only have 3 or 2.5 months of rainfall, and majority of the people depending on that very short rainy season, for them transformation could be defined differently compared to the Congo Basin, where you have huge rainfall in some locations, but few less in some areas.
Thank you.
If you compare it with the highlands of Ethiopia, that's also the issue. But what we need to look at when we think about adaptation from a transformation point of view, it's about the context. We need to capture that context if we have to really say that we have led to a transformative action within that reality. it's
Excellent.
difficult for us to generalize it, but that's what I think would be
Larissa,
forward, at least from
I'm really apologetic. We have to close here, but just let me reiterate what you said. It's about the context. That's why measurement is so difficult. It's about the complexity of adaptation interventions. We have multiple systems that are interacting. We need to find ways of how to make this clearer, make this simpler, and then have good measurement systems that allow us to understand what's coming in the future. And here, the third ingredient is timing. It's all about timing. If we want to learn, we need to learn in real time. And if we want to learn about what impact we had, we need to come back post evaluation, post end of project to evaluate how much of an impact we had. Thank you very much for the session, and thanks audience for being so nice to us and staying for another 5 minutes. Thanks to the audience online. Thanks to the panel online and the panelists online and the speakers online. And thanks, of course, to the speakers and panelists here in the room. Please stay tuned. Tomorrow, at the same time, we'll have a discussion only about private sector, not adaptation, but private sector, and how difficult it has been to evaluate private sector here at the GCF Pavilion at 6:15 tomorrow. Please join us and have a good conversation with us. Bye for now.
Thanks to you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.